This episode is brought to you by Alphasense, the AI platform behind the world's biggest investment decisions. The right financial intelligence platform can make or break your quarter. Alphasense is the #1 rated financial research solution by G2. With AI search technology and a library of premium content, you can stay ahead of key macroeconomic trends and accelerate your investment research efforts. AI capabilities like smart synonyms and sentiment analysis provide even deeper industry and company analysis. Alphasense gives you the tools you need to provide better analysis for you and your clients. As yet another value podcast listener, visit alpha-sense.com/FS today to beat FOMO and move faster than the market. That's alpha-sense.com/FS.
All right, hello and welcome to yet another value podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Walker. I'm checking to make sure my mic is working. With me today, I'm happy to have on, if you like this podcast, I mean a lot if you could rate, subscribe, review it wherever you're watching or listening to it. I'm all over the place today because I've got one of the people's favorite guests, my favorite cartoon lawyer, Lionel Hutz. Lionel, how's it going?
Going really well. I am so happy to be back. You can't get rid of me on like termites at this point. I full infestation.
Guess anything? Didn't you just have Lionel on? The answer is yes, but there is a lot to talk to Lionel about. Before we get there, just going to remind everyone, nothing on this podcast is investing advice. That is always true, but particularly true today. You can go hear all of my previous disclaimers on the Spirit JetBlue merger, but this is a hairy legal situation with probably a lot of downsides. Spirit, as the closing arguments make clear, Spirit's not doing too well these days. But this is a hairy legal situation. I am not a lawyer. Lionel is a cartoon lawyer, so please keep all of that in mind. Consult a financial advisor, do your own diligence, do your own work, all that. Anyway, Lionel, the reason we're having you on is because on Wednesday, December 13th, Spirit and JetBlue and the government filed all of their closing briefs, closing arguments, findings, facts, conclusions, law, all that. We're having you on probably for the final Spirit podcast that we're going to do, which makes me sad, but we're having you on to talk about the findings from those findings. So I'll just toss it over to you. General takeaways, the government put out their post-trial briefs and findings law. JetBlue put out theirs. What's your general takeaways from them?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to, applaud the JetBlue writing here. It was really a well done post-trial brief, very efficacious writing. And so, I try to divorce the quality of the arguments from just the quality of the writing. But certainly the JetBlue brief reads very persuasively. Both sides certainly regurgitated a lot of what we heard happened at trial. There are not just the briefs, but there are the proposed findings of fact and the conclusions of law submitted along with these briefs. There's hundreds of pages. There are pressure points or deficiencies in each. I will say overall, I found JetBlue's briefing to be substantially more credible, and I think they raised some serious deficiencies in the DOJ's briefing, which I'm happy to dive into.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let me look. And in total, I think there's 1,000 pages of rulings here, right? It's like 6 different things, 3 from each side. It's 1,000 pages. So I feel like I've got stuff just oozing out of my brain here. But I think the best way to structure it is, let's start just by walking through the DOJ's case, right? So just kind of going through the post-trial briefs and their findings of facts. And one thing that jumps out to me, again, this might be leading the witness, but one thing that jumps out to me, especially the findings of fact, the government comes out and really starts by trying to lower the bar for themselves, right? Direct quotes are, hey, I think this needs to be blocked, and this is the direct quote. If there's a less than 50% chance of harm, this needs to be blocked, which, wow, that's a really low bar. And then they even say, hey, to block this, we do not have a high bar to block this. The precedent does not set a high bar. So they're literally telling you they're trying to lower the bar themselves. I guess, again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a layperson. My question to you would be, is this typical in kind of a trial? Just come out and tell the judge, hey, this is a really low bar for us to hit? Or was this kind of the government telling on themselves that they think they have a weak case that kind of couldn't go over a high?
Yeah, you're always going to set forth the legal precedent and the standards and say why you can meet those standards or rebut those standards. And it's very typical, to characterize these standards in a way that sounds more advantageous to your own position. So I'm not surprised they did it. But I do believe that they perhaps slightly insincerely characterized the standard in some points. I mean, you're right. So the 50% or 51%, that comes from the ultimate burden of proof that the DOJ has, which is to prove by a preponderance of evidence of substantial harm. And preponderance of evidence is more likely than not, right? It's 50% plus a scintilla, 51%, whatever. It's more, the needle has to not be in the middle, and it has to be, moving in your favor. But the problem is they really conflate it with the issue of substantial harm. And that's where the tension arises, because there are multiple places, and we can get into it. They do this when they apply the timely, likely, sufficiency entry standard in terms of what newcomers would have to replace. They really misquote the standard there as well, and they effectively remove the word substantial from harm in the way they characterize that legal standard. So to answer your question, I'm not surprised they did it, but I am surprised perhaps at how bold they were in attempting to really lower that bar in a way that I don't think Judge Young will respond positively to.
I think JetBlue would even say they not only tried to lower the bar, JetBlue would say they tried to play dirty pool, because at one point in JetBlue's, I think it's their post-closing trial briefs, they say, hey, the government, they've got this great sentence where they're talking about harms and stuff. That is not, and they try to pass it off as this is a precedent case. And JetBlue says that's not a precedent case. What they did is they took two unrelated cases and they grafted the words from two unrelated cases together to make it seem like there's a precedent case with a commentary that's better for them than it really is. Was I misinterpreting that, or am I kind of saying JetBlue was trying to call dirty pool on that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, look, they do it in several places. I think, for me, the most egregious was probably the timely, likely insufficiency area, where they essentially wholesale drop that substantial standard. But you're right, they did combine a few cases in a way that made it read like the standard was lower. And I think look, you're not going to get anything past Judge Young. I mean, he had a 5-minute tangent in closings where he was asking the DOJ just what exactly is the presumption here. When you say presumption, is it a presumption that pops when JetBlue has met its burden of production? Is it a presumption that lives on? How do you characterize this? And if you actually notice in the DOJ's conclusions of law, there is a case in there that is completely unrelated to antitrust. It's Terry v. I forget what exactly it is, but you can look up later. Unrelated to antitrust, where they say a presumption of this sort is a presumption of the middle ground, and it's one of Judge Young's own opinions. And so, the DOJ is really just trying to grab anything they can that seems reasonable to characterize these standards in a way that is most advantageous to them, even if it perhaps, even if these standards aren't even coming from the same field of law.
Perfect. So just going to the DOJ's case, the DOJ cites very heavily the Philadelphia National case. And, there are two cases. There are three cases if you include, I think it's Brown, but there are really two cases that both sides talk about a lot. The DOJ talks about the Philadelphia National case a lot, and the JetBlue talks about the Baker Hughes case a lot, and Baker Hughes came up a lot at trial. I'm a layperson, obviously, but I just wanted to ask, the government cites Philadelphia National a lot because they believe, obviously, it's great for their case. It's a great precedent. So could you just walk through for the lay people what the Philadelphia National case is and what the precedent it kind of sets that the government thinks says, hey, this precedent says JetBlue Spirit should be blocked?
Yeah, well, there's a few cases in this lineage. The first is Brown Shoe Inc. I think it was a 1962 case that essentially was the first case blessed by the Supreme Court that set forth this quick look doctrine. We'll look at combined market shares of the entities, and if it seems like an issue, it rises to a certain level, then that is, there's some presumption of anti-competitive behavior there. Philadelphia National Bank was, I believe, 1 year later or 2 years later, shortly after. And it expounded upon that in a few ways. But I think what's most notable about Philadelphia National Bank is not really the decision itself, but the decisions that came immediately after it that expounded upon Philadelphia National and cited to it, which essentially said that once the government has met its burden of demonstrating there's a prima facie case and established this presumption, the defendants have to demonstrate by a clear showing that the merger would be pro-competitive or that the government's position is not based on reality, essentially. And the issue with that clear showing language is it sort of injected this burden of persuasion into the framework and placed that burden of persuasion on the defendants. Now, the government is bringing this case. The burden of proof is always with the government. And so Baker Hughes would ultimately sort of clarify that case progeny. It would overturn a lot of the cases that cited to Philadelphia National Bank. Philadelphia National Bank remained intact because it itself did not include that clear showing language. But Baker Hughes clarified the framework. It said, here are the 3 steps. And it said, step 2, so after the government has met its initial burden.
Why don't you, so Baker Hughes, as you said, it's a 3 step. So we're talking, why don't you just lay out the 3 steps that Baker Hughes says?
Yeah, so I guess before the 3 steps, the government will identify a relevant market, and it'll be, usually product and geography. And then within that market, they will generally show a presumption of anti-competitive effect by way of the combined market shares of the merging entities. That will get them over their initial hurdle of step 1. And then the ball goes to the defendant's court. And the defendants then have to produce evidence. It's a burden of production, not a burden of persuasion. And that's important. And that's kind of what Baker Hughes clarified. It says, this is a burden of production. The defendants just have to produce evidence. They don't have to essentially sway us with this clear showing. They have to produce evidence that rebuts the government's presumption of anti-competitive harm. And then if the defendants have met that step 2, then we go to step 3, where the government has an additional burden of production that merges with the ultimate burden of proof, because the burden of proof is always with the government. They always have that burden. And the government has to supply additional evidence of anti-competitive behavior for why the merger should be enjoined.
And now a quick break to remind you that this episode is brought to you exclusively by Alphasense, the AI platform behind the world's biggest investment decisions. Alphasense gives you the tools you need to provide better analysis for you and your clients. As yet another value podcast listener, visit alpha-sense.com/FS today to beat FOMO and move faster than the market. That's alpha-sense.com/FS.
That's perfect. So I guess just going back to it, and we'll be talking a lot about Baker Hughes in a second, but the government does cite Philadelphia National Bank quite a bit. And I think part of that is because under the Baker Hughes framework, I think the burden might be a little bit heavier on the government, a little bit lighter on the defendants. But why else do you think the government is citing Philadelphia National Bank so frequently in these arguments?
Yeah, well, there's language in Philadelphia National Bank, and I forget the exact language, and some of the case progeny that essentially says that you can't weigh markets against each other, that relevant markets are distinct. There are several other cases that the DOJ cites in support of that contention, but that is a major crux of the DOJ's case.
So this is, there are a few bear arguments, but this is one of the bear arguments that has come to me that I think is interesting, right? They're saying, hey, look, if you go back to the post-closing trial arguments, right? And I did a whole podcast with this on MDC, if you can go listen to it. But if you go back to the closing trial arguments, which you were there for, the judge asks a witness, he said, it seems to me that one of the things I have to weigh in my mind in this case is the harm in local markets, right? Which is a route to Orlando to Las Vegas, local markets, the harm in local markets from this merger, and weigh that against the benefits on the national scale, where JetBlue and Spirit merge, and now you've got kind of a fifth competitor that can compete with the big four who have 80% of the market, right? And the bears point out to me, hey, this is why Philadelphia is so important here. Philadelphia says you can't use benefits in one market to offset harms in another market. That's where the government's trying to go with this. What do you think about that framework as it applies here? And obviously, we'll talk about all sorts of other things with the routes. But what do you think about that framework in that bear case?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally a valid contention. I think there are a lot of issues when it comes to whether or not to view this with a national or local lens. I mean, there are issues with the factual evidence that came out in the trial. There are issues with the expert testimony and what factual evidence they used in support of their conclusions. And ultimately, there's an issue of kind of overall reasonableness, in terms of how likely new entrants will be in terms of entering these routes that Spirit may leave, and whether or not that actually requires a 1-for-1 matching of what Spirit currently offers. Certainly, weighing upper class customers against lower class customers, if
upper class against lower class, how elitist of you, Lionel.
Yeah, that was perhaps an oversimplification. But, I think had the DOJ characterized the relevant market differently, it would have mattered more. But the reality is, even within a single origin destination pair, you have, both classes of customers, if you will, who will see benefits from the JetBlue Spirit merger, the benefits of nicer planes, of better routes, etc. So I think there's so many issues here in terms of factual evidence, the expert testimony, and even within the narrow lens of the DOJ's own standard here, I still think that JetBlue has room to rebut that presumptive harm.
That's great. One of the things we can talk about Hughes. There's so much I want to talk to you about. And again, I encourage everyone who wants to listen to this podcast, go read at least the post-closing trial briefs. I think you'll get a lot more from it, but I can't force you to, obviously. One of the things JetBlue says is, hey, government, you tried to have it every which way. And they say this along a lot of lines, right? In particular, when it comes to national or local routes. But I'll give a small example, and then you can kind of dive in. But one of the ways the government tries to have it is the government says, hey, JetBlue's over there arguing that Spirit is in maybe not the stress, but Spirit is flailing, right? They're losing money. They're having to cancel growth plans. They're having to dial back their growth plans. They're delaying plane orders, right? JetBlue's over there arguing that Spirit is a flailing firm, and you should not believe that for a second. Spirit has said they'll get made whole on the GTF issues. Spirit is going to be a viable competitor for years to come. Ignore the leverage, ignore the distress, right? So they have that there. But then in the government's closing arguments, they also say, hey, if JetBlue finishes this deal, JetBlue will be a leveraged entity. And as a leveraged entity, they won't be able to grow as quickly. They won't be incented to compete as much. So that's just a small example, but the government's trying to have it both ways, right? Ignore Spirit's leverage, factor in JetBlue's leverage. And that's small. There are some much bigger examples when it comes to routes. But I just wanted to ask you about the kind of have it both ways-ness, and JetBlue explicitly makes it in their arguments, the have it both ways-ness that JetBlue's arguing for.
Look, I mean, you're spot on in terms of the flailing firm defense. They do say that. They say JetBlue, the combined entity, will not be able to grow as quickly. But at the same time, they say that, well, the routes that new entrants will be flying, it really should replace not just the routes that Spirit is flying now, but also the routes that Spirit would grow into. And that is a huge tension that you point out, right? Because, Spirit won't be growing into these routes. And in fact, they've decided to divest or to leave, to exit certain routes because of the financial hardship that they're facing. And so I think you're absolutely spot on that, in one breath, they say, Spirit is going to be growing and new ULCC entrants need to not just match the existing routes, but those growth routes. And then in the next, they say that, the combined entity is really going to struggle and there's going to be no growth at all. So I think that's a major tension, even if it's a relatively minor fact. I think the larger have it both ways issue is the DOJ experts used largely national data to account for the harm to the consumers. And it's not, it's really attenuated from the actual origin destination routes that they allege are presumptively anti-competitive. That to me is a larger issue and perhaps fatal issue to the DOJ's case.
Well, this comes to, and I should have mentioned the start. Lionel has the new Valorem Substack, which I'll include a link to in the show notes. As people who listened to the Liquidity podcast last week know, I'm going to call myself a day -1 subscriber because I told Lionel over a year ago I thought he should do this. So I'm really happy he's got that. I'd encourage everyone to check it out. But in your kind of write-up of the JetBlue, of the closed trial arguments, you labeled 3 points that you kind of thought JetBlue really scored points on in these briefs. And the second point was, just to build on what you just said, was the DOJ's attempt to confine Judge Young to local markets, ignore supply elasticity, and is untethered from its own experts' testimony. So why don't you just dive into that second point?
Yeah, so I guess the second half of that second point is largely what I just said, that the expert testimony is based on national data. And so you really can't say that this is a localized harm, or that the localized harm has been proven with any modicum of certainty, when in fact that harm is based on data that the DOJ would actually tell the court to ignore for purposes of showing pro-competitive benefit, right? That logically is incredibly inconsistent. I think the supply elasticity points, the first half of my point two, is a really interesting one, because JetBlue cites to a case, Ball Memorial. And Ball Memorial was a case about insurance companies in Indiana. And the rule of law that came out of that case that is related to relevant markets was, even where you have a geography where the demand is geographically constrained, it may be appropriate to look at a broader geographic lens, even a national lens, when the supply is mobile and can go meet that demand. And so the issue was, these other insurance companies were actually able to, get Indiana licensure and provide, insurance coverage to the Indiana residents, even though the Indiana residents had to obtain insurance from Indiana providers. And that is, the parallels between that and this case, I think, are profound, because you have the exact same situation where, if there is a market where it is economically advantageous for an airline to enter, that airline will enter. I mean, somebody will go fill that void left by, perhaps a lack of ULCC pricing. I mean, everybody knows at this point that ULCC demand is out there. I mean, it's not just Spirit and Allegiant and Frontier anymore. I mean, United. We heard testimony from a United exec saying that, United has ULCC capacity and intends to grow that. And so somebody would go fill that and go travel to meet that demand. So even though the demand might be inelastic from a geographical standpoint, it's actually highly elastic from a substitution standpoint, which thereby allows other suppliers to freely enter that market.
One point I got a little frustrated that never got made. As you said, these are highly mobile markets, and the government, they started arguing like, hey, plane shortages and stuff, despite all the planes that are coming into the market and everything. But one point I wanted to make was, if these markets get profitable enough, like, you're going to have Indian Airline or Indian Airway or whatever they thought, they're either going to start flying domestic routes in the US, or, Frontier will be profitable enough for them to buy airplanes from Indian Airlines, fly them over here, and then start flying them, right? Like, obviously, I'm using Indian Airlines as an example of a foreign airline, but like, these planes are so mobile. It's not just the domestic market. Like, you can start buying up unprofitable foreign people and getting their planes over here. It's so mobile. It strikes me as crazy.
And I think the corollary to that is routes that become uneconomical are routes that airlines will leave anyway. Yep. So, and we saw that, when you look at, and we should talk about that, the 51 presumptive routes.
Let's talk about 50.
Yeah, so, the DOJ says, hey, there's these 50, they say really there's 183.
They started with 300 presumptive markets.
Yeah, now they're like, it's really 183, and like, let's walk through these one by one. No, they don't.
You and I are laughing, but we've read it. Can you just quickly define what these 51 presumptive markets are and how they're relevant to the case before we start narrowing them down?
Yeah, the 51 presumptive markets are, I call them like true overlaps, right? It's where JetBlue and Spirit currently compete head to head, and they're direct routes, as opposed to, combining different legs where you may or may not be uniquely competitive across that. Yeah.
And it's not just 51 where they compete, but it's 51 where they compete with enough market share that the DOJ is arguing like, hey, you guys, JetBlue, you have 40% of Las Vegas to New York. Spirit, you have 30% of Las Vegas to New York. Together, you have 70%. That's a monopoly. Clayton Act says, if you go over 50%, we can stop a monopoly. That's one route, one local market, one monopoly. We can block this merger. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I guess, to refer back to our original Spirit podcast, the way they determine that market concentration or problematic market concentration is typically this HHI index. So it's like a sum of the squares of market share. And so they say, hey, there's 51 routes where you guys directly compete and where your combined entity becomes problematic from a market share perspective under the HHI index. Well, going back to the point we just mentioned a second ago in terms of the, dynamic nature of the industry and the fact that airlines leave uneconomical routes, well, of that 51, Spirit has already left so many that now it's like 35, right? So it's like 16 routes, I guess. They I thought it was 17, but I guess 16. So there's 16 routes that they have left simply by way of their own economic interests. They did that, since the complaint was filed. They just said, look, our airline is not doing well. We have to, rearrange the planes. We have to put them somewhere else. We can make more money over here, whatever. And those are things that importantly, any airline would do, right? All these airlines are acting the same way in their own economic interests, and they will fly the routes that are most advantageous to them. So now you got 35 routes that are left. And of those 35 routes, 27 are the subject of divestitures. So, we talked in our first podcast that, they divested in the Northeast, and they divested in Fort Lauderdale. And so now, one of these nodes in this origin destination pair, importantly, the constrained node, the node that's really hard to get a gate and a slot, that's open. So now if, Frontier or Allegiant wanted to fly, LaGuardia to Kansas City, well, sure, maybe Spirit didn't divest Kansas City, but you don't need to divest Kansas City. I mean, Frontier, if they can get LaGuardia, they can fly LaGuardia to Kansas City if it's in their economic interest. And presumably if Spirit is still flying that route, it's probably in their economic interest. So there's an indication there that they would likely fly that same route. So now we're down to 8 routes that are left among those 51 presumptive routes. And there's only 2 origins there's only 2 nodes among those 8 routes left. 6 of them are in Orlando and 2 are in San Juan. Importantly, those are not gate-constrained airports. Orlando has 2 airports. San Juan has undergone some expansion, I believe, and has open gates and slots. And so JetBlue says all you can point to really is these 8 origin destination routes that have Orlando or San Juan as a node, and they're not constrained. So if it's economically advantageous for Frontier, Allegiant, Avelo, whoever to do it, they can do it. They're free to enter that market as they wish. And if there's a ULCC lack of capacity, if there's suddenly a dearth of ULCC seats, then they would be economically incentivized to go do so if they can make money there.
The other thing that JetBlue says there is to say, hey, Orlando, Allegiant has said that's a growth market for them. I believe that's one ULCC. And San Juan, Frontier has said that's a growth market for them. So it's not just that these are open markets, it's that ULCCs are trying for them. Let me provide, one thing. So the math there was 51 to 35, 16 of those routes have been just exited naturally by Spirit. Then 35 to 8, that's the big jump. And the way they make that jump is JetBlue says, we've agreed to divest these 27 routes. And one thing the government comes out really hard against in their arguments to say, hey, Judge, there's these divestitures, right? These divestitures of routes that, it seems pretty clear Spirit and JetBlue are saying, hey, these could be an antitrust problem. That's why we're divesting them. And the government is extremely skeptical of these divestitures, right? They say, hey, Judge, you don't know for sure they're going to happen. We had testimony from, I believe it was the Fort Lauderdale airport manager who said, hey, JetBlue can say they're going to divest Ed, but we control these gates. We approve the divestitures or not. So who knows if they're going to divest them? And the government also says, hey, let's say JetBlue is divesting LaGuardia to Fort Lauderdale, to stick with that example. They can divest the assets to Fort Lauderdale. They can to Frontier. They can divest those gates, but there's no guarantee that Frontier is going to fly Fort Lauderdale to New York. So who knows? That will actually bleed into your point 3. But I just want to ask you about the government's skepticism of divestitures overall. We can talk about the replacing one-to-one offset in later.
Yeah, I think it's a really insincere argument. I mean, I don't blame them for trying, but gosh, where to begin? I think so we have historical, well, I don't think we have historical precedent that says, where there are issues of divestiture for airports, they have historically appointed a trustee who will essentially manage the sale of these assets. And importantly, it's the airports themselves are incentivized to distribute these assets in a way that benefits their communities. And so if it is beneficial to their community, if they have a lot of leisure travelers who fly Spirit and go to these locations like San Juan, perhaps they're not going to, New York for business or whatever, then the airport is incentivized to give those slots to the airlines that will fly them. And we've seen this before where we didn't know exactly where the gates and slots would go. It was overseen by a trustee. I forget which case. It might have been the United merger.
I think it was AMR. Let me just add, it's so interesting to me that the government saying, hey, the airport authority has the ultimate authority to divest these gates. So they might not go to ULCCs. And JetBlue makes this point. They say, hey, if the airport authorities have it, like they will divest it to whoever they think is the best person for their community. So it seems really disingenuous and just skeptical of all people. It's like, it must be Spirit flying here. If the airport authority chose to divest it to Southwest, I'm sure it's because they thought Southwest was actually the best for like serving their local community needs. It seems very crazy to me that you'd be like, airport authorities might not approve this.
Yeah. And I mean, this goes back to the standard that they lay out. I mean, they say, all this needs to be replaced one for one, and they just don't have any support.
So let's go.
Yeah. They don't have any support for that. But I will, I guess, add to your additional point of like, the DOJ also says, well, they're not guaranteed to fly the same routes. Not only is that, I think, a misreading of the law, but I think it's, I said a little bit ago, if it's economically advantageous for Spirit to currently fly that route, say Fort Lauderdale to Kansas City, then you can assume that it's probably economically advantageous for Frontier to fly that route. And that's going to be a logical route for them to enter. Now, the DOJ would say, oh, there's certain aspects of like the Allegiant business model where they say they don't want to compete. And there's certain aspects, and maybe Avelo just doesn't have the planes or whatever. But I think even those are betrayed. Those points are betrayed by the testimony from Frontier's CEO, Barry Biffle, alone. I mean, it's betrayed by testimony throughout the case, but Barry Biffle in particular, who said, look, as soon as these routes are divested, there's going to be a feeding frenzy. We're going to jump on these things and, tear it apart. I can replace all of these routes inside of 5 years. There was a ton of testimony from him in particular about how he would be incentivized and ULCCs in general would be incentivized to go fly the routes that Spirit fly. So I think it is a misreading of the law. I think it is a misunderstanding of the reality. And the simple truth is that if an airline, if these routes get divested or the locations, the destinations get divested and Frontier is not flying that same route, it's probably because Spirit wouldn't have been flying that route anyway. It's a route that they would have likely exited. So I think it's an incredibly insincere argument on the DOJ's part.
There, just one other thing I want to comment here. So JetBlue argues a lot about, hey, the government has frozen these markets at a single point in time to choose their harm. And you can't do that. And part of the reason they say that is because, hey, we exited 16 markets. This is extremely dynamic industry. And the government had a response that said, yeah, look, we understand, but we had to freeze them at a point in time or else how else are we going to evaluate harm? And I was like, that's exactly the point. If you freeze them at a point in time and it's always changing, like that's the point of mobile markets. Let's see. I think we hit your 1-for-1 offset, which was your third point. So let me just go to expert witnesses, right? I'm going to try not to lead the witness here, but there's a lot in both sides' testimony about the expert witnesses. Expert witnesses are hugely important in an antitrust trial. So I just want to ask you, A, why are expert witnesses so important for the layperson? 30 seconds of that. And then B, maybe you could talk about how you think JetBlue and the government handled the expert witnesses here.
Yeah, expert witnesses in many ways, I was going to say put a bow on the case, but I think they really make the case. They don't just put a bow on it. Expert witnesses don't testify to facts. That's what fact witnesses are for. It's in the name. But what expert witnesses do is they synthesize those facts and then they rely on those facts in conjunction with their expertise in whatever area. And they will really, their testimony goes to the heart of a case. It goes to, in this case, the harm. Is there harm? At what scale? Etc. So, all of the fact witness testimony up until then is really just to kind of get these tidbits in so that the expert can then come in and say, yes, I relied on X, Y, and Z, and this is the ultimate harm. This should be the ultimate outcome. So that's kind of why they're important. And I was, when I left the closing arguments, I think the expert witness point is what made me most concerned or most skeptical of JetBlue's case. I had heard through multiple people who were sitting in the courtroom that the expert witnesses for the DOJ had not really carried the burden for the DOJ, and during closings, I expected to hear JetBlue hammering on those deficiencies quite a bit more. And they really didn't. I mean, they pointed out a few issues, but they didn't harp on it in the way that I thought they might. And it turns out, I think that may have been a bit of a strategic decision. I think they may have withheld some of the punches there so as to not tip off the DOJ into, bolstering that part of their post-trial briefing. And I think it was ultimately fairly effective because they do talk about the deficiencies in JetBlue's post-trial briefing, and they seem quite damning.
And I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, like the reason, as you said, the reason you wouldn't tip the government off in the closing trial arguments is because then the government's going to spend a lot of time in their closing briefs trying to shore up, right? They know, so they're researching, they're trying to shore it up, try to defend any mistakes. If you don't hit on any, they might not know they're coming. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the government tries to bolster or defend their expert witnesses once in their closing arguments. And JetBlue hits the government expert witnesses really hard. Am I misremembering that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the reason I expected to see more of an attack was because of the timeline of a potential decision, right? I mean, we heard that Judge Young had already started working on his opinion in the middle of the case. And so, in my mind, I'm going, geez, they need to get this in front of Judge Young. They need to hammer this home. They shouldn't be saving this for a rainy day. They need to get this in front of them now. Ultimately, I think he's got plenty of time to sit on the briefing and evaluate these deficiencies. So it seems like it was, it's probably a pretty effective strategy.
So let's talk about the deficiencies that JetBlue finds with the government witnesses. Kind of what are they and why do you think they're, again, I'm leading witnesses, why do you think they're so damning?
Yeah, I mean, JetBlue talks about how they bifurcate the witnesses so that neither one of them had to face cross-examination on particular issues. I think, though, the most damning aspect of the expert testimony is the data that they relied upon. It's national data. And I think, Dr. G's model in particular was, I don't even know, I mean, looking through the findings of fact for JetBlue, it's incredible. I mean, they point out the ways in which his model can go askew. And basically, he says that with a couple fewer seats on a Spirit plane in certain markets, I think it was Las Vegas, you'd see 30% increases in price, even though both JetBlue and Spirit had a combined market share of, I don't know, a couple percent or even less. So, it's just the models end up being so ridiculous, and they're predicated upon, exclusively national data, which the DOJ says that you shouldn't be looking at for the alternative purposes, the proving of the pro-competitive benefits. So to me, those are really fatal deficiencies in the DOJ's case.
This is what JetBlue said, right? Hey, even Dr. G testifies. It's look, I'm using the national data to assess local level harm. And then when they point out errors in his local level harm model, he says, well, really, the data works better on the national level. And this is what JetBlue is saying. Hey, the government's trying to have it both ways. They're trying to prove local harm, but use national data while ignoring national benefits. And by the way, saying it's not a national market, you can't have it every which way. There's one more really interesting thing where they say, hey, in the Los Angeles market, if you toy with the model a little bit, you can generate $1 trillion worth of consumer harm, which I think the US GDP is $12 trillion or something. I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's if you can generate $1 trillion worth, that I know LAX is big, but I didn't know it was quite that big,
Would have been better if it was the Burbank airport.
So yeah, look, I think people could hear it. You and I, we did a podcast, if I'm remembering our podcast versus our just offline chats correctly, we did a podcast before the trial started where we said, hey, we think JetBlue's winning. I don't think we've done another Spirit update between you and I on a podcast, but people could hear the NBC podcast halftime report. He was probably 50-50 for JetBlue. Closing trial briefs, he's probably a little bit more in favor of JetBlue. People can probably hear you and I are very much leaning towards JetBlue. We'll save our percentages for the end. But I do want to hit you with some concerns I had, because it's not like the government made no points. They did make some points. So I want to hit you with some concerns, and you can tell me if that's a big area for if that's a big area of concern or if that's redundant. The first is the government does hit on a lot, right? And I hear bears a lot will say hot docs. Originally, the hot docs were all the hot docs from Spirit when they were trying not to get bought by JetBlue. I think those have largely gone to the side. They're not entirely, so ignore those. But there are hot docs from JetBlue when they were trying to buy Spirit. Their internal modeling had a 30% increase in fare, right? And this has come out 100 different times. But the government uses this a lot in the trial. And I think what they're saying is price increase. That is the definition of consumer harm, price increase. And JetBlue was modeling a price increase when they were looking at buying Spirit. They hit on it multiple times. So how do you think about that? A direct quote from the government is unabated 30% fare increases.
Yeah, I think JetBlue did a nice job of deflecting the blow there. And I kind of said this, in our original podcast, that I didn't think hot docs on either side were going to be particularly problematic for either party, just because of the nature of a bench trial and who was presiding over the case. JetBlue says that those numbers were for purposes of, merger modeling, and it's not a business plan, I think is the quote. It's not a business plan. And certainly the economics of the business have changed quite a bit since those initial merger docs were created. I think, proving that an acquisition could possibly be accretive or could result in a scale that makes the business more relevant I don't think that is, in other words, I believe JetBlue that I think it's tough to say that is an exact business plan and that you're going to see 30%. Importantly, you're going to see 30% in every route, including exactly these 51 origin destination pairs. I mean, again, you're talking about looking at macro level data to bolster specific origin destination harm that's being alleged.
Two questions there. The 30%, as you said, what they keep partying on is a 30% increase in Spirit prices in a merger model. Is there precedent either way, whether ignoring merger model as just financial modeling, not an actual business plan, not admitting price increases, or using a merger model as an evidence of plans to permanently increase pricing and market power? Is there any evidence or precedent on using that merger model either which way?
It's a good question. I don't know is the answer. I suspect even if there was, the fact that the economics of the business have changed so drastically in the last, 12 months or since the complaint was filed, at least, I suspect that, whatever language might be included in that hypothetical case law would probably be rendered fairly inapposite with the facts in the instant case.
Let me ask you another question here. So the other thing JetBlue would say, and JetBlue's experts testified to this, they would say, hey, do prices go up on JetBlue flights versus Spirit flights? Maybe. But a large part of that is because people would prefer JetBlue, right? And they say, there's a quote, I'm going to give you a quote. More fundamentally, acquiring assets and improving them to the benefits of consumer is not in itself a violation of Section 7, even if the new business model leads to fares commensurately higher with the higher product quality, right? So they're saying, hey, if our prices go up a little because we're offering a better products and people are choosing to pay for it, great, not a problem. There's precedent there. The government has a counter to that, and this is like paragraph 101, so they don't really lead with it, but it did strike me as interesting, and this was one of the words that they say, hey, there is precedent. If you acquire someone and you can make people pay more for a better quality product, there is precedent that says that is not an efficiency, that's an argument for market power, and a merger should be rejected on that. Kind of how do you think about those two conflicting views? And I didn't pull the precedent, both of them are pointing to precedent that supported both those opinions.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a mischaracterization on the DOJ's part. I mean, look, at the end of the day, antitrust law is about preventing consolidation of power, not strictly market share. And it's about preventing consolidation of power, which can be used to, when it's multiple actors, they can be used to prevent those multiple actors from acting in their own economic self-interest and using that power in an abusive way. And so I can't remember that exact case name, but I think there was a bit more of, I'm going to call it abuse at issue versus simply a selection of a different business model, which we have here. And I think that quote from JetBlue is particularly compelling. I mean, we've talked, look, if a private equity firm came in and bought Spirit and, stripped the planes down, sold them for parts, I don't think you'd see the DOJ bat an eye. And that is problematic, right? I mean, that is a business model choice that a private equity firm could make unfettered. The DOJ would not step in. And yet somehow, because it's JetBlue making that business model choice, that has become problematic. And I think the real crux of all of it is that even if you assume that is anti-competitive to a degree, that there is harm, you have testimony in the record from ULCCs, and not just any ULCCs. You have testimony from the largest, the next largest ULCC. The CEO, his testimony saying, we're going to come in and we're going to replace all these routes. So even if there is harm, ultimately, the timing, the efficacy, it's the likelihood that harm persists in an anti-competitive way is so low in my mind, particularly when you view that, look, you have to allege this harm on a multi-year scale. JetBlue has said they're not going to start integrating Spirit and JetBlue planes for at least 12 months, maybe 18 months. Frontier's CEO, Barry Biffle, said, I can replace all these flights inside of 5 years. So what you're left with is a period of 3.5, maybe 4 years tops, where you might have harm to consumers if you assume that all of those other things are true, that the expert testimony is valid and it's, it relies on, correct factual evidence, et cetera, et cetera.
And just to add to your point, that's assuming that you have Frontier has to be the person to replace every single Spirit route within about a year, right? So, if the government believes that Frontier, you need, the only way to replace Spirit is to have the largest ULCC player in America replace every single one of their flights with the ULCC. Yes, Frontier specified it will take them, he said 7, but he could do it in as fast as 5, right? So yes, that's true. That would take 5 years. I think what we're hoping for is that other ULCCs and other people will step in a little sooner than that. So let me ask, that's mobility of market. We're coming back to the ball precedent that you mentioned. And I think the government would come back at you with 2 points. Number one, paragraph 23. So obviously that's very high up in their findings of fact. They say, hey, as an initial matter, Supreme Court precedent prohibits the justification of fare hikes imposed on consumers flying in a particular market by pointing to benefits accruing to consumers in other markets, right? So what that is saying is, hey, if prices go up on some of these local markets, the 51 presumptive markets we've talked about, but there's national benefits overall that are encouraging things. They're saying you cannot consider those kind of the benefits that outweigh the harms. That's number one. And then number two, I think it was about paragraph 32. They have a footnote that says, hey, by the way, on the mobility of assets, the JetBlue's own expert, Dr. Hill, he has testified in a prior trial that he does not believe in the mobile expert's defense, right? So I think when you could combine those two, you could see a way that that the government's trying to reject JetBlue's kind of feeding frenzy, frontier, mobile assets argument. I threw a lot out to you. I did some quotes. I did what the government did. I blended quotes and anecdotes. But what would you say to that government defense?
Yeah, I might have you repeat one of these questions. I would just say...
you know me, just throwing 1,000 questions at it.
The first part... sorry, I was taking notes while you were saying that. So the first part, okay, yes, there is Supreme Court precedent that says you can't essentially weigh the markets against each other. However, even if you look within a single origin destination pair, you will see benefits there. Now, it's benefits in terms of better quality, et cetera, that the DOJ will say some people simply don't want. But you can argue that there are benefits on a local origin destination level, and you don't have to look nationally. I think the national discussion, the quality of national benefit, if you will, that goes more to the issue of the DOJ's inconsistency than it does the legal precedent. The DOJ, as we've discussed, used national data to allege the harm. And so it's very difficult logically or to be consistent logically and say that it is now irrelevant to use national data to show potential benefit. And certainly we can point back to the Ball Memorial case, which would say that even if there is harm, even if you assume that you're only looking at local levels and any pro-competitive benefits do not outweigh the anti-competitive harm, you still have the issue of a dynamic industry that can geographically move to meet the demand that exists there the void that is left by a Spirit departure. So I think there are just multiple levers that you can pull in order that kind of dismantle the DOJ's case.
You did a great job saving me and answering all of the 1,000 questions I just asked.
I forgot your second part of the question. I'm sorry.
No, I think you hit it. So one other question I have here, and again, I'm biased. I'm trying to check my bias, but when I read these cases, I'm just like, I think JetBlue's got the best of it, and people who've listened to these podcasts know why, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. But one thing that jumps out at me is the government is basically coming out and saying, hey, every person who's worked in this industry, every industry insider, you've heard from multiple competitive CEOs, whether it's United CEO saying we're eager to expand, we're ordering Haynes to expand our basic economy, whether it's Frontier and Allegiance CEOs to the number 2 and 3 ULC players who are saying, hey, we're eager to, if Spirit leaves these markets and Spirit exits the ULC, feeding frenzy, we're going to vacuum out this market. The government is basically saying, ignore every industry insider and rely on our expert models who, I think JetBlue has done a very credible job of showing are extremely flawed. Rely on our expert models and this presumptive harm, even though no one in the industry can point to it, to block this murder. Like, that just strikes me as tough. Having read, I don't know, I've probably read 20 judge rulings. You've probably read 2,000, but it strikes me as tough for a judge to say, ignore everything an industry is saying and let's rule for the government.
What you're highlighting is really the DOJ's experts, the factual underpinnings or alleged factual underpinnings of their conclusions are themselves conclusory. They can throw a label on something and say that this is a high barrier to entry market, but you have testimony from disinterested third parties, at least disinterested as far as this immediate case is concerned, saying, yes, I will swoop in and I will replace these. I will, put the planes where they need to go, and we can do it without decreasing services to our existing routes. We're going to, if we can't do it organically, we'll acquire planes inorganically. We'll lease them instead of buying them. We'll do whatever the heck we need to do to get in there and replace these routes. So I just think when you actually strip away the conclusions, strip away, what the experts label or how they characterize the market, and actually look at the evidence that underpins those conclusions, you see that there is an inordinate amount of evidence in support of JetBlue's position and very, very limited evidence in support of the DOJ's position. And most importantly, they explicitly contradict that inordinate amount of evidence in multiple places. So it sort of requires Judge Young to not just believe the DOJ, but also to reject the many instances of what I think is likely very credible testimony from fact witnesses who have no reason to get up there and lie or say anything that wouldn't be true or extend the truth in any way. I mean, these are industry witnesses that are all acting in their own self-interest, and I think it would be excuse me, I think it would be crazy for Judge Young to reject that.
Yeah, like I'm with you. Another thing I would just mention, it's the Deutsche Telekom case, but T-Mobile merging with Sprint. The case is in early 2020. That was a 4-3. It's cited often, and I think I personally would have rejected that merger. I'm not an antitrust merger. I would have been wrong, but I think I would have been wrong for the right reasons that make sense. Because the judge approved it, I think in part because he thought Dish was going to replace Sprint as the fourth player. And Dish abjectly failed at that. But Charter and Comcast came in with their MVNO and have really revolutionized the wireless market. And T-Mobile's that's neither here nor there. I do love telecom though. What I am saying is there's a lot of precedent for this. And I think the Deutsche Telekom case, which was very recent, where the government was for this 4-3, that was actually states tried to sue to block that. I think the government's going to have a lot of trouble with that particular precedent case and some of the rulings. And I think the defendants here do a really nice job of sprilling that ruling and several other rulings that help them. But that ruling, and look, it helps when I think they've got the better case. But I thought that precedent was very.
Look, there are so many areas where the DOJ has these like logical inconsistencies, and it's not just about the facts; it's also about kind of the way they seem to characterize and understand antitrust law itself. I mean, they say that JetBlue, Spirit, becoming one of the major combined airlines will increase likelihood of collusion, and that's not true. That's not what antitrust precedent would say. It says, if you increase the number of competitors in a band of the market, if you go from 4 to 5 or 2 to 3 or 6 to 7, whatever, you're actually decreasing the likelihood that there is collusion between the parties, because there's more likelihood of independent, economic self-interest winning out, and it's just simply more difficult to coordinate. And there's a bunch of reasons why logically that doesn't quite make sense. And they point to things like the HEPCO codes and price flashing, and they make a big deal out of this. And it's like, that just, like, where are you going with that? Like, we already established there were like a couple instances maybe, and JetBlue says that's not a practice they employ, and there are ways to deal with that as far as like injunctions. It's like you can deal with that with a Sherman Act case later on if they're behaving in an anti-competitive way, but that doesn't strike me as a reason to prevent a merger under the Clayton Act. That seems so logically inconsistent to me. It's like mind-boggling.
So I think I mentioned it on one of the NBC podcasts. I was shocked by how much the government was asking this in the trial, and I was wondering why. And I mean, it's really high up in their, you lead with your best arguments, and it is really high up in their trial briefs that they think it should be blocked because of this flashing price coordination issue. And I was very surprised by this. And I just want to ask you a question here. One reason I was surprised by this was they would ask, they asked JetBlue's pricing person, they would ask industry insiders, and all of them would say, no, flashing is not an issue. There's no flashing. So the government's coming out here and they're trying to allege likelihood of flashing collusion, but they have no witness. They have no expert witness testifying to collusion, unless I'm misremembering. And they've got no witness testifying here. So it's a theory of harm without any...
It's patently speculative. It is, yeah. And it's funny because they criticize Mr. Sheff, who is JetBlue's expert, and he testified saying, the combined entity can actually be more efficient and it'll increase the seats because, we can run the planes at, red eyes, whatever. And they say, oh, Mr. Sheff's testimony is so speculative. And then they dedicate this entire section to the most speculative aspect of the entire case. It makes no sense from as you point out, the testimony that was present in the case. It makes no sense logically. It makes no sense. Like there's just no world where that is relevant to this merger, and they dedicate quite a bit of time to it.
So again, I would encourage, if you are a bear, and I know because I see the viewership stats, I know that these are getting watched very widely in the merger arbitrage community. If you are a bear, reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you. Lionel would love to talk to you. I love to have open conversations. I'm not criticizing anyway, but I would love to talk to bears in this case. So please reach out. Hit me on Twitter DMs. You can find me. The 4 bear cases I have heard. Number 1, JetBlue is going to walk. MAE claim, DOT craziness. I don't want to address that here. We're talking about the trial. We can go there. We've gone there in the past. We're not going to talk about those claims here. That's number 1 and 2. MA's 1, walk. DOT plus walk is number 2. I'm not going to go there. Number 3, before the trial especially, I would hear, hey, what do you have here? You have hot docs that say JetBlue's going to raise the price. You have hot docs of Spirit saying this is an antitrust problem. And you have deference to the government. Combine those 3 and boom, you've got a win. You and I heard it. I know we did calls with DOJ formers together. We heard it from a lot of bears. That was number 3. I think you and I have already talked about why. We already talked about the hot docs didn't matter. We already talked, not that they don't matter, how they were dismissed. We talked about the pricing issues. I don't think we need to address that. So I want to address number 4. The last fair point I've heard is, hey, DOJ won on the relevant markets. The relevant markets is route by route, origin, destination. There's clearly overlap on the relevant markets, and they didn't divest everything. Plus, there's some divestiture uncertainty. I think you and I probably already addressed that. But when you throw all that together, that's the path for the judge to block it, right? DOJ won on routes. There's overlap. There's some markets where it's going to be a market power or whatever, and the divestiture is uncertain. Boom, block. What would you say to that bear point?
Oh my gosh, so many thoughts. And I think a lot of it kind of, touches on things that we've discussed. But, this is a common theme, at least on Twitter and the emails that I get. People say, oh, it's all about the relevant market. If the DOJ wins the relevant market, case closed. And the DOJ, in fact, said almost exactly that in closings, and JetBlue threw it in a footnote and called it hyperbole. So if you want to open up the JetBlue briefing and Control F hyperbole, you'll see it.
Guess what I'm doing right now?
I don't think it matters. And it doesn't matter for a lot of the reasons that we just touched on. So even if you assume that those 51 markets are the relevant markets, you can get down to at least 8 that are, I don't think, still problematic, but you could allege that they are problematic. Let's assume, though, that you still have all 51, and Judge Young says, you know what, the divestitures don't count because you can't guarantee that the gates are going to Frontier and Allegiant, and you can't guarantee Frontier and Allegiant are going to fly the same routes, even though we've already talked about how there is precedent here historically to assign an overseer of the divestiture process, and that it's in the airport's best interest to give these to other ULCCs if that's what the community demands. And even though, Spirit leaving a route, they're already flying the most economical route, so presumably the new entrant would be incentivized to fly that same route. Even if you assume all of that, you still just have a failure of the burden of proof on the DOJ's point. And it really just comes down to the lack of factual evidence that we talked about, the lack of fact witness testimony saying that, these new entrants won't replace these routes and won't, feast on the dead carcass of Spirit's, void. And, the DOJ experts, as we noted, relied on national data. So it betrays their own arguments that local lenses are the lenses through which you need to view this. I mean, it's ridiculous to, as we said, in one breath say that, you need to use national data to prove the harm, and then in the next, that you can't use national data to prove the pro-competitive effect. It's ridiculous, and it's evidenced by how ridiculous Dr. G's economic model is that comes to those conclusions that we highlighted. I mean, it took the JetBlue attorneys just a little bit of tinkering, and they came to these absolutely patently ridiculous results just by moving around a couple numbers. And so I think even if you give the DOJ the benefit of the doubt on all of those points, I still just don't think they've carried their burden of proof. And yes, it is just a preponderance of the evidence. It is more likely than not, but it's more likely than not a likelihood of substantial harm. Substantial harm. And they try and strip away that substantial, but it's substantial harm. And I think that's what the DOJ would like everyone to forget, and what I think some of the bears maybe didn't quite catch.
And now a quick break to remind you that this episode is brought to you exclusively by Alphasense, the AI platform behind the world's biggest investment decisions. Alphasense gives you the tools you need to provide better analysis for you and your clients. As yet another value podcast listener, visit alpha-sense.com/FS today to beat FOMO and move faster than the market. That's alpha-sense.com/FS.
We mentioned it at the top, but if you go read the government's, I believe it's I can't remember its manufacturer post-closing chart, but it's really funny because from one paragraph to the next, they will switch from like the emphasis in on substantial. When it's on them, they'll try to emphasize every word but substantial. And then when it's on the defendants, they'll try to emphasize substantial as hard as they can. And, it's just having it both ways. Let's see. Again, I don't want to talk MA. I don't want to talk DOT. If and when we get a ruling, we'll have those conversations. I think you and I have addressed them in prior podcasts. I know we've addressed them in prior write-ups. People should go sign up for Lionel's Substack. I'll just throw that pitch in there. Let's quickly talk timing, because everybody wants to talk timing here. Everyone in the merger arbitrage community, everyone wants to talk timing. I know why everyone wants to talk timing. You know why everyone wants to talk timing. We won't mention the specific reason, but everyone knows why they want to talk timing. December 13th, late at night, all the filings drop, and now we could get a ruling. I mean, the ruling could come as you and I are talking, but we could get a ruling at any time. When do you think we would get a ruling?
Well, I think some people still believe that Judge Young is going to get it out by the end of the year, and I wouldn't put it past him. Again, he's senior status, right? So he doesn't have a full docket, which means that he theoretically has some time, although it is the holidays. And I think the last time he committed to a, before end of year ruling was at least before he delayed it a second time. It might have been before he delayed it the first time as well. So I think end of year is aggressive. I wouldn't put it past him. It's certainly not a zero probability, but I think you're probably looking at, first, maybe more likely second week of January. I think that's fairly reasonable. The one thing, I mean, look, I left the courthouse and I can talk. I got rid of some January call options because when
you said the magic word, so now we got to understand. Everybody should just remember options. That's why we're talking timing.
Yeah.
Options are extremely, extremely risky. Please, again, we said at the top, consult a financial advisor, but consult like 5 financial advisors and a priest before you look at financial advisors.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'm saying. But
certainly not an endorsement. Yeah, apologies for saying the magic word. Certainly not an endorsement of option trading. I will just say I had evaluated the likelihood of a post mid-January close and thought that it was a lower likelihood because neither side really answered Judge Young's questions directly when he was talking about what else might need to be done as far as divestitures, or what would be a reasonably narrowly crafted injunction that either side would accept. And both sides were fairly non-responsive in answering. And so I left thinking, man, there is a good likelihood that we see a remedies hearing, an additional briefing just on remedies. I don't think it's necessary. I think Judge Young has what he needs in his toolkit to be able to
if he called a remedies hearing, right? I think he would call that before issuing his opinion because he would want to craft the remedies hearing into his opinion.
Absolutely.
If I led the witness, would you agree with me if I said if he calls a remedies hearing, it's because he's getting ready to approve this merger with remedies, so he wants to know specifically what he wants? Or is there still a chance he hears a remedy hearing, he doesn't like what he hears, and he just says reject it?
There's definitely still a chance that he rejects it. I mean, the point would be to ascertain the reasonableness of those remedies, and I think the DOJ would continue to assert that no remedy is reasonable other than a permanent injunction. I think it would be very hard to only take that stance. They might, kind of argue in the alternative and put forth maybe some ridiculous amount of divestitures that may or may not lead to, an MAE for the combined entity or whatever. I don't think it would be a good faith, assertion of what divestitures should be. The DOJ would probably offer up San Juan and Orlando, as they kind of did in their briefing, and maybe a couple more origins and destinations as well. I mean, they could offer up planes as well, right? Planes haven't been on the table, and they could offer up planes. So there's definitely still a chance that it would not go in JetBlue's favor, but I do think that if we do see a remedies hearing, it probably puts a thumb on the scale, even more towards the side of JetBlue.
Last thing, investors, one thing that struck me, again, I've said this before, this judge, I've got huge respect for him just from what I've seen and heard through this trial. I think he's done a great job, and I've done diligence, talked to people who've been in front of him. He is not an antitrust judge. There aren't really antitrust judges out there except for maybe Delaware, I don't know. But this is his first antitrust case as far as I'm aware. He asked a lot of questions on what he could craft, his powers and stuff. And I personally think the government came out and said, hey, we reject everything. You have to block this merger. I thought JetBlue did a great job of saying, we think this merger stands on its own with the divestitures, but here's all the precedent cases and all the power you have to craft additional remedies if you do. And they noted hey, the government's worried about divestiture. You can appoint a divestiture monitor who will oversee the divestiture, and we've committed not to operating these assets anymore. So you can guarantee divestitures. You can do it. I don't know. I just thought they did a great job of laying it all out. And I think the judge reads that and he's going to understand the flexibility. So again, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Judge Young has had a couple antitrust cases, but one, he granted a motion to dismiss. So it really, there wasn't a lot out of that. Although JetBlue did, actually both parties cited that case, interestingly enough. I think it was 10x Genomics is the thing.
That was it. Yeah.
Yeah. What was I going to say? Even I think he understood. He may not be a quote antitrust judge, not that there is one, but he may not be a super expert in antitrust, but I think he absolutely understands his powers and understands how antitrust law works. I think he was kind of kicking the tires of each party's arguments and seeing where they might give a little bit, where they appear more reasonable, what what is the veracity of the claims they're bringing, and how willing might they be to craft that remedy with him if it's needed. But yeah, I think he was more kicking the tires than truly seeking an answer as far as what his powers are here.
Here's my theories on. I mean, if you just want me to randomly throw out. So next week we're taping this December 15th. I'm going to try and get up December 17th or 18th. December 18th, I think that week would be the most likely if we're going to get a ruling this year, but I don't think it's super likely. I'd probably throw it at 10% chance. I'd throw the week of the 25th. Look, this is an 82-year-old judge. Do I think 25th Christmas is a Monday? 29th effectively serves as New Year's Eve in terms of holidays and stuff is Friday. Do I think he's going to publish a ruling that involved 1,000 pages of review, a multi-page, like something that's going to be quoted for years to come? Do I think he's going to publish it in between Christmas and New Year's? The answer is absolutely not. So I would put it at like 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
A week after that, week of January 1st. January 1st is a Monday. That's New Year's Day. I kind of suspect he's not going to publish it that shortened week either. So I've got the week of January 8th circled as when I kind of think the ruling is most likely to happen. And again, this is unscientific, but
I think that's reasonable. And you bring up one good ancillary point, which is here's a judge who I don't think he's so selfish that he like only cares about his legacy, but he's old enough that you're probably you have a propensity to think about legacy when you're that age. And he has the ability to craft an opinion that might be precedential for years to come, particularly in dynamic industries. And so the likelihood, so many people have said, oh, he's just going to cite Philadelphia National Bank and call it quits. And I'm like, do you know anything about this guy? Like, I think saying, he's a Reagan appointee and he's going to rubber stamp it. That's a complete failure to understand him, but at least, it's based on fact. I think saying he's going to, cite Philadelphia National Bank and call it quits is both a failure to understand him and not based in any sort of fact. This is a guy who has a chance to set some seriously defining precedent, and he's willing to do it. This is like, he loves his job. That's what he wants to do.
I'm going to give you a joke and then a serious thing. The joke is I was joking with someone earlier, and he's in his 80s, right? So I think he graduated law school in the late 60s, early 70s. I can't remember for sure. But, when he graduated law school, Philadelphia had just come out or was coming out and was a precedent case that everyone would have been talking about. So one of the jokes we had was, look, maybe the government's hoping that, he's just remembered his law school and they quote Philadelphia. And he's like, oh yeah, that's a seminal case. You've got to go with the Philadelphia. And he's ignoring all the precedent cases and all the case history that's happened after.
He's like, that was at the end of the textbook. That's where antitrust law ends. That was the latest case. It never went further.
I remember Professor Griffin teaching me that. You can't go wrong with agreeing with Philadelphia. That was a joke. But, last thing and then we'll go. With MDC, I've made this joke and I told it to you before. I kind of want to file an amicus brief with the court and say, hey, if you rule for the government, you've just ruled that they can protect certain business models and they can choose winners and losers effectively. And JetBlue actually makes that point in their brief. They say, hey, the government is effectively arguing, if you give this, you've given them the right to choose business winners. And I think JetBlue makes that because A, it's true. That's effectively what he's done. But B, they're also appealing to the judge's legacy. Hey, you have two choices here, right? You can make this ruling, and then it's going to be the next 20 years until it gets up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturns this because it has to be overturned. You can't give the government the right to choose business model, in my opinion. That's the route one. Or B, you can rule dynamic industries, all of these interesting things, and basically Ball, which gets cited 100 times in this case will be the new Ball, right? Every time you've got a mobile industry, people are going to be citing this. And, there's a Hawaiian-Alaskan merger coming. When that gets tried, the post-closing trial findings of law, they're going to be citing this case, both sides, 1,000 different times. So I do think they are appealing to his legacy.
Yeah, and he can use kind of the agency's own words against it. Like, I don't know if we talked about like committed versus uncommitted markets. We may have that, the FTC at least has published saying, in committed markets, that's markets where it requires quite a bit of scale and effort to enter. Basically, you need to look at those more critically when you're saying that replacement is coming online to replace the lost business that of the acquiree. I think he can say, look, we have an uncommitted business model here. We have an uncommitted market where these planes are free to come in and out as they please. So long as it's not maybe a couple markets that are constrained gate-wise. But the FTC has basically said exactly that when you have an uncommitted market, it's less of a concern. And so I think he has the ability to craft a very interesting decision that kind of does this jujitsu, like uses the weight of the FTC against them in certain places, even though, again, this is not FTC, but it still, applies just, from a mental framework standpoint. He has the ability to craft a very interesting decision, and I look forward to reading it. I don't think it will be as simple as, PNB and we're out.
My favorite jujitsu in this case, though, and I just have to mention it because it actually made me laugh out loud when I read it. The government they say, hey, there's this precedent case that says you can't buy mavericks in an industry and you can consider a firm's maverick status when rejecting a merger. And the precedent case they cite with the quotes is a case that said JetBlue itself is a maverick. It was the government arguing that JetBlue is a maverick that impacts industry pricing from the Northeastern Alliance case, 6 months ago. And I just thought it was so funny that they would have the balls to argue, hey, Spirit's a maverick. You can't buy Spirit because they're a maverick. And the precedent case we're citing is that JetBlue, the buyer here, was ruled a maverick not more than 6 months ago. It cracked me up.
Yeah, mavericks can't buy mavericks. That's the rule of law.
Lionel Hutz, you and I, what are we talking 10 hours a week, 12 hours a week these days? Because we've got a lot going on, but I can't.
It could be more.
Go ahead.
It could be more.
I can't.
A lot to talk about.
I can't encourage people to sign up to Valorem Research enough. Obviously, we've done Liquidia and Spirit because those are two of the most interesting legal situations out there. But the good news is, Lionel and I are always talking. There are several more. So, Lionel, we're going to have you back on the podcast in the near future. But really appreciate you coming on and looking forward to the next one.
Can't wait to come back.
A quick disclaimer: nothing on this podcast should be considered investment advice. Guests or the hosts may have positions in any of the stocks mentioned during this podcast. Please do your own work and consult a financial advisor. Thanks.